Who here was in our ASP.NET Core class? Anybody? All right. This is all new stuff, mostly, compared to that. There was a little bit of stuff where Damien just went off about app service because he's an app insights, because he wants to be an evangelist for app insights. But other than that, it's all new. So I'm going to be talking about getting the best out of ASP.NET on Azure. When I originally signed up for this talk, I thought, well, I know a good amount of stuff about ASP.NET Core, and I know a good amount of stuff about Azure. And so the Venn diagram, there's going to be enough for an hour, and it's not really going to be that difficult and all that. Then as I kind of dug into it more, there's like all this other stuff floating around out there. And what I really ended up with was that there are not just a few different things, but there are a lot of things. And what's really the interesting thing is all the interconnections and how they all fit together. And this is all completely impossible, and we're going to die. So it's what I took another look at was I came back to what are some things that are useful to know about. So this obviously could be a week-long course. I'm going to talk about some high-level things, good things to know about. So we're going to work across deployment options, troubleshooting, a few performance tips, security tips, and monitoring and diagnostics. I'm going to spend the majority of my time on deployment options and monitoring and diagnostics, and I'm going to try and point you to resources, things to know about if you want to dig deeper into them. So let's start with deployment options. I love to use this slide because this girl is calling a cloud, or she has an umbrella shaped like a cloud, and she's on a moped, and I just think it's great. So we're going to talk about deployment options first. The easiest one, of course, the simple one to start with is Visual Studio Web Deploy. There's two ways to do that, and one is file new project, deploy it, and the other is a self-contained deployment. And whoa, I thought I had a demo slide. That's fine. Visual Studio Web Deploy, I'm actually going to just start with that. And I like to, have a short time to first demo, so I'm in under 3 minutes, and that's pretty good. I'm going to be using Visual Studio 2017 RC, and I usually tend to use community. I want to show things that, this is free and not have that be a barrier. Who here's using Visual Studio Community? Visual Studio 2017. You ready? Okay, cool. I'm enjoying it is running side by side with 2015, fine for me. There's one exception where it can mess with your path. It's pretty well documented, but and I'm no longer projecting, so that's good too. I have no longer been projecting for a bit now, right? And you guys are you're just going to let me do that, weren't you? For the entire rest of the hour. And then as I walked out, I'd be like, oh. All right. So I'm going to start with just simple file new. And I'm just going to walk through this amazingly quick. So I'm going to do file new, no authentication, web app. I'm not going to turn on Docker support. I'm going to talk about Docker in a bit, and I'll forget to mention this checkbox, so I'm mentioning it now. There's this checkbox on there where you click on that, and you can turn on Docker support to run locally and deploy. Set up your Docker files and do all that stuff. So I'm just going to say, OK. I'm creating a new web app. This is using the latest preview that goes with Visual Studio 2017. As Damien mentioned, and he wasn't supposed to, but there's a new release coming very, very soon. And so I'm just going to go straight from here, and I'm going to say publish. And then from that, the dialogue's changed around a little bit, so the general idea is, no, I should have a profile. I can say, I guess I'll need to create another one, fine. So, I can select existing, so that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new one. So I select on app service, and these are all the different things you can publish out to, including, I'm not going to dig into this, but you can also deploy to a virtual machine if you want. So that is one thing. So then the idea of filling this out, you go through, you give it a highly descriptive name, as you can see I've done. You go with no, use a different. So just general tip, I tend to create tons of resource groups. when I first saw resource groups, I was like, I don't want to hassle with it. I threw everything, and I just didn't want to think about it. I tend to try and give things descriptive resource group names, and to create a ton of different ones. Now, in this case, I've already created one that's NDC London, I believe, but I've found that that's really helpful. And as an example, especially as I'm just trying stuff out, I can go through, try it, see how it's working for me, and then delete it. And what's nice with that is if I'm creating something like, say, a Azure Container Service where there's like 95 different resources, when I say delete it, it all goes away. So that's kind of a nice handy way to make sure I've gotten rid of everything. I'm not sure at all. That looks great. Nope. I guessed wrong. There we go. And I'll say create. All right, so this is setting up a deployment profile, and I'm expecting, I think it was just a few seconds when I did it. After that, I'm sure, who here has never done this deploy from Visual Studio to Azure? All right, it's worth running through because it's pretty darn quick. So now I just click on Publish, and this goes through and uses Web Deploy and deploys it directly up. So what it's doing then is creating the resource for me. It's already verified that the name of the site is available and all that, and I'm not seeing it publishing, which is neat. Let's try that one more time. Web publish activity. There it is. It's going. It just didn't want to tell me about it. That's fine. So it goes through, it copies everything up, it makes sure the build runs and all that, and the site pops up, right? So that is kind of the very simple, quick thing. I'll let it keep going, but the finale is you see a website running up in Azure, which is, you're probably not going to be that surprised with that. So I'm actually going to skip on to the next thing while it's doing that. And that is the idea of self-contained deployment. So I was talking to David Ebo, who's the PM for a lot of this stuff on App Service, the deployment infrastructure, and Kudu and all that. And he was saying that, one thing that might be kind of interesting is the idea of bring your own framework. So for instance, when you're running on App Service, you are relying on what they've deployed to App Service. You're relying on their kind of custom-built, images. They call them stamps. So you're waiting for them to release the latest ASP.NET Core. And if instead of waiting, if you want to release a specific version that they don't have deployed up there, you can do that pretty darn easily. So the idea is if you go to what's called a self-contained deployment. So Scott Hanselman has a post on doing that, and it's really not a whole lot of steps. The main thing really is that you are going through, you're specifying your runtimes that you're going to support. So that's that runtime section. And then here you do .NET build -r, and you can build for a specific thing, right? And then you publish, so .NET publish -c, and you release, you create a release. So it is a specific, keyed to a certain OS. And so instead of just kind of publishing it up to Azure App Service and saying, you build it, figure it out for me, you're saying, I am building this thing, and it includes all the dependencies with it. So in this case, this is going to look like not scrolling, which is interesting. So there it is. So you're going to end up with a folder that's got all the stuff in it. They also have, this is the Project JSON based, and they also have one that's out on the, if you search for self-contained deployment, you'll probably find it. But this is in the official ASP.NET or .NET docs. And the self-contained deployments here spells out what you need to do for that. So in this case, this is actually it's not the newest ASP.NET Core, but I'm assuming you're not all immediately rushing out and deploying the newest every day anyways. But the general idea here, they walk you through doing it, and it's the same sort of idea. You set up property group, which you list out who you're deploying it to, and then it's the same, .NET build, .NET publish. When you do that, you have all your files, and you can deploy that all directly up, right? You can do a simple, FTP or whatever. So that's the idea there. Let's see what's going on there, and I think you are done. The cannot fail simple demo, and it's already off the rails. So let's go on. Kudu deployment scripts. So the idea with Kudu deployment scripts is, who here has no idea what I'm talking about when I say Kudu? Okay, there's probably more of you. So Kudu is this kind of secret behind-the-scenes deployment engine that can handle deployment, and it handles all this like continuous deployment. And so, for instance, I think actually I have a next one. There it is. It's after that. These are my demo slides. I always like that. Continuous deployment is the idea of I hook up an Azure App Service to a repository, right? So in this case, I'll go and do that. So since the Visual Studio-based demo is not going well, I'm gonna switch around and do an Azure App Service-based deployment. And that's not clicking either. Let's see if that works. No. All right. Can't stop me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an app service, and then I'm going to point it at a repo. And the advantage of doing that is every time I push to that repository, App Service is watching for that. Kudu is watching that specifically, and it goes and it will pull the changes, and it does a build. It's got a very smart sync system where it only pulls what it needs. And yeah, okay. I see you. All right. Let's go to Chrome then. One strike, you're out. Okay. So, and never mind those. Okay. Totally going to work. Okay, so Kudu is that infrastructure, and it's actually relatively complex. What it's doing is it's checking out the files. It checks them out actually to a share. It's not, so there's actually two different drives associated with app service, every app service you have. There's a local and there's a home. And local is a fast drive, but it's not permanent. And the reason for that is if you scale up or down, if app service has the ability to kind of move you around to different, if one thing needs to be shut down, another will be brought up. So those local drives, those local instances are not going to be permanent. Also, anyways, if I scaled something up, the new local drive is not going to be the same on each one, right? So the way that works then, there's also a share, and it's called your home directory. And what that's doing is that's actually running on a blob storage, and it's using a symlink, and it's pointing over to that. So Kudu is doing this thing where it's checking out the files, it's using that share, it's doing the build, and it's copying the stuff over that you're going to need, like for your www root, et cetera, onto your local drive. All right, let's see if that one's working. Nice. All right, so I'm going to create a new web and mobile web app. We'll call this monkey face. Oh, it's available. Should get monkeyface.com. Okay, we're going to do existing. There we go. I'm not turning on Insights just yet, but I will. Let's go with Free Northern Europe. Sounds good. Okay. So this is spinning up. Normally this is going to take like 30 seconds or so, right? So once that's done, what I'm going to do is click through to my deployment and say, instead of publishing this directly from Visual Studio up to App Service, that's fine for something quick, or honestly, if it's your blog, or if it's just something that only one developer is using, you can kind of get away with that. But in the real world, you're really going to want to be doing continuous deployment, and so there's support for continuous deployment from GitHub, other Git endpoints. There's Visual Studio Team Service, all kinds of different endpoints you can use, right? So I'm going to go through and click on Deployment Options, Configure Required. So these are some of the different ones. There's some interesting ones here, like you can have it deploy directly from like OneDrive or Bitbucket, et cetera, Dropbox. So I'm going to point it at GitHub. And it should, I haven't logged in yet on this one, so it's going to make me do that. We'll see if I've authenticated on GitHub here recently. Good, I have. Okay. So it understands the different organizations I'm in, the different projects. I've got one here, ASP.NET Core App Service. For this one, literally all I did was this. I created a new repository on GitHub. I cloned it locally. You can go either direction, but I cloned it locally. I did... seem to have a thing for monkeys. I did .NET new -t for template, web. And then, so I did git clone, git add, git commit, whatever. And then I did a git push, right? So that's all, the point is, that's all that's there. There's no special kind of hookup of anything, right? So that repository is just a repository that holds file new project of an MVC application. So this is going to go through and start that deployment. Compared to classic ASP.NET, ASP.NET Core Git-based deployments are taking a little bit longer in general. They are working to improve that quite a bit, but they do take a little longer maybe than you're used to. So let's go and see where that's at. Deployment succeeded. All right. So now, if I click through again on deployment options, we'll see where that's at. So yeah, it said created, and it's now building. Okay. As it's building, I'm going to switch over and show the idea of a Kudu deployment script. And the idea with that's a more advanced thing, but that allows you to do quite a bit more with customizing what exactly is going on with your deployment. So they have all these hooks, and you can create ones. This is a deploy.ps one. And the reason this developer created this, I'm pointing actually, this is on an issue on the, this is a public issue on GitHub. And this is an issue that's been closed because it's been fixed. But with the ASP.NET Core module, and the problem was there's this app offline HTML file that's used as a placeholder. So when a new deployment's happening, this app HTML or offline HTML is written. The site knows it's offline, and it just serves that file. The problem was it was case sensitive. So so it was being written by deployment as capital A app service, but the ASP.NET Core module was watching only for lowercase, and it wasn't seeing it. So what somebody did here is they said, you know what, I can solve this, and they actually created a deployment script. And so this is very easy to plug in. And what's kind of neat with this is they just, as part of this deployment, they copy from a template, and they set a new output. What's cool with this is they actually created a separate template, and they're able to customize how exactly their offline script looks. Right. So that's kind of a more advanced, interesting thing you can do. Let's go and see if this is done. Still building. All right. So there we go. So that's continuous deployment. We just looked at GitHub. One other thing to be aware of, and I actually did this on purpose this way, because the deployment is, like I said, is a little bit slower. It's still just a few minutes, but it is a little bit slower. Another option you've got is to use something like continuous delivery. So the idea is, I'm deploying, I'm going to want to use deployment slots. Who here knows what a deployment slot is? Okay, cool. So that's actually, let me pop over here again. You have this thing, okay, so it is actually live now, right? So the site I've deployed is live. I can go through and click on it. Go in here. And we should see the file new project for ASP.NET. So it was deployed, but it was not spun up. This is another issue, right? So for the first hit, even of a deployed website, it's got to spin up. It's got to wake up and and do the kind of first initialization stuff, right? So there's a few ways around that. One is to use deployment slots. So the idea with deployment slots, and this is on a free plan, but you click it and it says, what's the name of the slot? And you just start filling it up. You can have as many deployment slots as you'd like, so you don't just have to have two. But a common way is you'll have one that's staging and one that's production. And the way you set it up is you deploy to staging, and then you have an internal private URL that you can hit, and it would be, in this case, monkeyface-staging.azurewebsites.net. And then I go out to that, hit it, make sure that it looks good. When I'm ready, then I click this swap button at the top, and that switches positions, and it makes the one that I deployed to a staging, it promotes that to production, and takes the production one and takes that back to staging. There's a lot of nice things with that. One is, and I'll get to some more of these later, talking about configuration. One nice thing is that I can preview it, make sure that it works. I can always look at the offline before putting it online. So I essentially get 2 sites for free. Another nice thing is that I can have slot-specific settings. And one final thing is that I can preload, like a lot of the time the first hit on the site, like we saw there, took a few seconds for the site to say, like, yeah, I'm here, just a sec, let me get that page for you. So if I can pre-warm that, and maybe my first load of the site is seeding data, or it's doing some other caching and that kind of stuff. So I can do that first hit before swapping it to production and making it just pop up immediately. So I can do that stuff manually. I can do that using things like Kudu deployment scripts, where I can go in and ping it. I could even get creative and use something like Azure Functions and do some sort of automation in there. And I've seen people do that. Here's a kind of more holistic way of doing this. This is definitely more of the, if you're living in the Visual Studio Team Services world. But actually, this does have support for Git as well, so it's not totally true. But the idea is you have this whole cycle where you have code, build, test, and deploy. And so you have automated tests that run, and those can include things like verifying the site is up, that the response time is okay and all that. And then it will automatically swap into production. So it makes sure that everything's up and running and then switches it around. Cool. All right, so that is the standard kind of app service stuff. Another interesting thing is app service for Linux. Has anyone used app service for Linux yet? No, good. I didn't think so, actually. It's very new. So it's actually kind of mind-blowing. App service for Linux is running in Linux, and it uses Docker. And the idea is that it uses Docker containers, which gives a lot of power for, you can have multiple containers, you can have different images and all that. It's a pretty efficient way for managing that kind of thing that I was pointing out that Kudu is doing. The interesting thing here is there's support for 2 different ways of using ASP.NET Core under app service for Linux. So one would be, if I go in, I can create a new one. So I could say web and mobile, and I say app service, web app on Linux. So okay, and then we'll say existing. Again, I'm going to pop it in to the same one. There it is. Okay, cool. So here where it says configure container, there's a bunch, the customer requests that really kind of drove them to build this was more PHP and Node. There's some things that are in the PHP and Node world that really kind of work best on Linux, and they said, that's fine if that's what you want to do. But you'll see down here at the bottom, there is this option for .NET Core. And so I can go in and I can create it using that. So what's also interesting, though, so that's the kind of, I want to spin this up, and then I have to create my Docker container. And remember that checkbox I said I'd forget, but I actually remembered that is in Visual Studio. So if I'm creating a Docker container, I can push that up. Looks like I'm going to be late for a meeting. And so that works. But I can also point it at a Docker repository. So I could go in and I could, Let's just go to quiet hours. Cool. I could point it at a private repository, or I can point to something on Docker Hub. So in this case, the PM for this is created, deployed MVC Music Store up to Docker Hub. So his name's Nazim Lala, and it's Music Store. Right? So then I click OK. So it's going to validate, yes, that exists. And then it's doing this Docker deployment. So it's pulling that image down from Docker Hub. It's 114 megabytes for this image. So this is a pre-baked image that has kind of everything in it that's necessary. And I should have clicked create. So before talking. So the deployment on these I'm actually seeing is really fast. They go through and usually go pretty quickly. So there it is, succeeded. Cool. And so again, those are the kind of, all of these, the whole system for app service on Linux works with Docker, and I can do it by going through and saying, this is my thing, and then uploading my Docker, pushing my Docker stuff from Visual Studio or uploading however. But I can also just say, don't you worry about it, here's my Docker image. And a neat thing with that is that Docker image, it can be any Docker image. Like as long as it's a Docker image that'll serve a web app, there's examples where they're serving Ruby on Rails or whatever. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And then here, this is just kind of the standard MVC Music Store example, right?
Is there also this Kudu management process?
So kind of, but it's different. So, and I'm glad you asked that because I was going to forget to show it. There's in Kudu, there's a whole kind of system where you can go in and see what it's doing and how it works. The short answer to your question is not really. As soon as I go in and configure it pointing to a Docker instance, then if I go in and say deployment options here, I believe it's going to say, there's ways where you can go through and it'll say, no, you can't do that anymore because you use this other one. But in this case, yes, I can point it at like GitHub, right? So where was I? What else was I going to say? Oh, as far as Kudu goes, though, Kudu has this whole kind of deployment system, but it also has kind of a back end where you can go in and look at what's going on in your app. So anyone use this before? The advanced tools stuff? This is pretty neat. So this will go through and it'll show me what's going on in my environment. This is very handy for diagnosing what's going on in your .NET apps. So I'll show you more of that in a second. But I also can go in and do things like, in this case, because it's running on Docker, so it's a Linux instance, so I can go in and I say ls, and I can start doing Linux stuff and get myself in all kinds of trouble. I don't know, I'll start deleting bin or whatever. So anyways, that's kind of the whole Kudu thing. So the kind of infrastructure stuff is different. The idea is that, the app service, what it looks like to you as a consumer should be the same. So that's kind of the idea. All right. So that's app service for Linux. And the idea there is this works great for single Docker instance. So if I have one single Docker instance, I want to deploy it, I can auto-scale, but it's going to be just that one Docker instance. So the one other thing is if I want to get, if I want to get a little bit more fancy, there's the Azure Container Service. Is anyone using Azure Container Service? Okay, cool. Azure Container Service, I debated back and forth about doing the demo on this. It's not super hard, but it is time consuming, and I don't think it's super worthwhile in this case, but let me see if I can, no. There it is. There's good documentation on it, actually, if you go onto into the docs for Azure Container Service. I love Anthony Chu's post on this, though. He basically walks through how to do it. So once you've got a Docker, the idea is Azure Container Service is a whole service that can host multiple different things. It has advanced stuff. They recently introduced support for Kubernetes. There's also Docker Swarm and Mesos. Docker Swarm is probably the simplest if you're used to Docker, because you basically just run your standard Docker commands and it farms it out to the whole kind of swarm. So I just say Docker, Docker build, Docker run, and it says fine, and it runs it on all of them. But there's also, like I said, support for Kubernetes, et cetera. So the idea here is I have to SSH, that's the one thing. A simple way of creating a Docker thing is to use Yeoman. So if I do yo ASP.NET, it will create a Docker file. I can also, inside of Visual Studio, I can create a Docker file. Just right-click, add Docker support, or click that checkbox when I start it. The Docker file, here he's showing how to monkey with the Docker file to make it work. You don't have to do that anymore. It's all set up so it'll just work. And then you do Docker build, Docker run. It thinks for a second, and then you get your your endpoint to the swarm from inside of there, and then it runs. It does the whole kind of spin up of the container service. Takes me a good, say, 5 minutes, or maybe a little more. You're spinning up virtual machines, there's load balancers, there's all kinds of stuff going on. So the idea is, again, that if you want just simple Docker instance, that's it, and you might scale it to have many instances, but there's not really much going on. You could use app service for Linux. If you want more advanced things, if you want to, like something like Kubernetes, or Mesos or Swarm, you can do some orchestration where you can say, I would like this group of these things to hook up to this group here. I have networking in between them all. I can have, this is my whatever data services cluster, and this is my web tier cluster and all that, and I can manage that. And that's where you'd go to something like Azure Container Service. All right, we're a half hour in and we've covered one of the 5, but that actually was kind of I was planning on focusing on that. So let's talk about deployment troubleshooting. And an important point with deployment troubleshooting, one of the key things is to know how it's actually being hosted under app service or IaaS, really. And the whole thing is this ASP.NET Core Module, or ANCM. And so the idea with this is actually your request comes into IaaS, which connects to the ANCM, ASP.NET Core Module. Runs the ASP.NET Core Module. And then the ASP.NET Core Module spins up Kestrel, and there's this connection between them. And then Kestrel is actually running inside your application. That's actually something that took me a little bit to realize. Kestrel is not a separate executable. It's not a separate server running somewhere. It's actually a NuGet package you pull into your .NET application. Once Kestrel is inside your application, that gives your application HTTP serving capabilities, right? So your .NET app is now a web server. It's not a battle-tested, super secure web server. It's a lightweight HTTP server. So you don't want to throw an app with Kestrel out on the internet because it's not battle-tested, right? It's not, you're going to get hacked, or you're not. It's not tested for high-performance, secure web serving. IaaS is, HTTP sys, listener is, but not Kestrel itself, right? So anyway, the idea is that you've actually got this reverse proxy thing going on. And one of the most trouble-prone areas is actually this connection when it connects over and wakes it up and says, start up when I have a response from you, what's the port we're running on? There's a handshake that kind of goes on, and then there's this connection over HTTP between IaaS and your app. Okay, so one of the more common areas where you'll actually find something going wrong is in that step. And there's a great post on this, and it's 3D, there it is, 3D Logic. So this guy's actually on the team, and if you remember nothing else from my talk, really, I recommend you go and look at this, because he does a great job of explaining the whole kind of dance of how it loads up and gives kind of a checklist of Here's what I pointed out as far as how they kind of connect together. And then there's this interesting stuff in here as far as what's going on inside your app, as far as how IIS knows about Kestrel and the ASP.NET Core module. So there's actually a handler, this ASP.NET Core, and that's where that module is kind of mapped in. So we originally told you with ASP.NET Core that you weren't going to need web config, and that's mostly true, and they're actually doing work to completely remove this again and make it just magically work. But the idea really is, by default, file new project, you will get a web config, but it's just these lines that just say like, hey IIS, or app service running IIS, this is how to run this module that it connects over. There's some interesting stuff in here too, because ASP.NET Core, this thing here, has these arguments, and some in there include things like logging to a standard out. So you can log that to a file, and that's something that can be useful as far as troubleshooting. So anyways, that's kind of the idea of how that works. He goes into a lot of other things, and he points out some things as far as troubleshooting, make sure that the module's installed, that sort of stuff. So very, very kind of detailed check of how to do that. Cool. So anyways, that's kind of one of the kind of key fundamental areas, is understanding how IIS and app service are both connecting into your app. And it is a difference if you're used to the old model where IIS pretty much directly hosted your application, right? It was kind of IIS and your app is inside it. And here it's now IIS or Nginx or whatever is the proxy web server that's pointing over to your web application. So as I mentioned, there is that log to standard out. And that is really helpful for if there's something with ASP.NET Core module unable to connect. When you get this, they call it the white screen of death, where you get this HTTP 500 error, and it's basically ASP.NET Core module saying, like, I don't know what happened. And what that means is that this handshake didn't work. Like 9 times out of 10, that's going to be the issue, is ASP.NET Core module tries to connect over to your application, and there's a problem in the handshake. There's a, I forget, it's not a secret, but there's kind of like a handshake key, a token, that's it. So if the token doesn't match up, if the port doesn't match up, et cetera, then it'll say, hey, sorry, couldn't start. And probably the best way to find that is turning on those logs to standard out. So how to do that? You can do that directly in your application. It's still canceling. So I can go into here, and I could go in and say log standard out, change that from false to true. I can also go in my service. So I've got an existing, is that going to work yet? That's just going to get confusing if I have 2 dashboards open. Right. So if I go in here, I can turn on things. So this one's on Linux. So I'm going to switch over to my other one. Monkey face. Okay. So in this, I can go into my application and I can start turning on that logging stuff. And there's actually some changes we just recently did in order to make that easier to track. And so that is under, is that under logging? So app settings, here, log. There. So here I can go in and I can say, which by the way, I don't know if you caught that there, but that list gets kind of long. You can just search at the top for it and it'll narrow it down. So here I can go in and I can say application logging, and I can also, and I can set the different levels and application logging to blob, and I can start controlling where that stuff goes as well. So, and logging to blob storage, obviously, I have to configure a blob storage. So, there's also the Kudu console. And I mentioned that a bit before, and I showed it in the context of the Linux app. But in here, I'll show you what it looks like for the kind of Windows-based one. So if I go into the console area, so this is really pretty interesting. There is a console here, and I can do, I can go and I can start, messing around on it. I don't like this console as much as the one that's actually just in the advanced tools. And there's also this editor preview. So they used to call it Monaco. You can go in and you can directly edit files, right? So I could go in here, go to my web config and change that log to standardout as well. But I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do instead is I'll just bring up this advanced tools. So this advanced tools, if we zoom in on this, the URL for that, you just take your URL and put .scm. So monkeyface.scm.azurewebsites.net. And that is this kind of backstage thing. Who here has used Kudu a good amount? Like, okay, yeah. It's one of those things where, like, once you know about it, you're like, yeah, that's cool. A lot of people, when I show it to them, they're like, what? I never heard of that before. So you can go in and you can go into the environment, and you can see all your environment variables. This is really handy for seeing things like, specifically what's going on as far as like what .NET version, what's my path, all that kind of stuff, right? So that's handy. I can also go into, there's this Process Explorer, and in this case, I'll see, it's taking a bit to refresh here, I believe. There it is. So you'll see here I've got, for some, I don't know why I have a note on this. I have the .NET EXE running, being connected to by the W3, WC, or whatever, that guy. And what's interesting is I can go into here and I can do things like I can start profiling, but I can also click on properties here, and I can see things like environment variables. And there's some specific ones you won't see in the main environment variables, but you'll see this here. And there's this ASP.NET Core. And there's this thing where this is the port that the front end IIS is connecting to me on. This is this internal port. And there's this ASP.NET Core token, and that's what it's using to kind of agree on that handshake between them. Right? So there's a ton of information in here as far as diagnosing and debugging as well. One other thing that you can do, if I go into the debug console, there's a PowerShell and a simple command-based one. And I can start going through and doing stuff like, I can say, see if this works. Okay, so here I'm running, I can see the site. This is the home drive. This is the shared map drive, right? So this is every instance, if my site scales, every instance is pointing to this one share. So the advantage is that's all up to date. That's always, I can push to one place and those files are served everywhere and all that. The disadvantage is there is some network latency on that. And so there's actually this sync process where it copies stuff over. So if I go to, okay, so. Here's this local, and inside of that I can go to, there's app data. There's this is all the local stuff where it's serving from, right? And then you'll see back here this symlink that's the one pointing back to the other one, right? So there's kind of two of them, and that can be helpful to know about as well. What am I going for? Home, local. So anyways, in here I can go and I can say like .NET, right? And I can see what's going on. I could actually I could probably do like .NET new or something. I have no idea what that would do, but so I do have the ability to do that stuff. There's even in here, there's some crazy other stuff. Like I can, do local stream. I can download my deployment script. So if I've published a custom deployment script like I showed you, I could go in and mess with that. There's some neat stuff on here too if you go looking around. And again, this is on every app service site. This is running in the background. So you have all this ability to kind of go digging around in there. If I go, so this is the actual site. So here I can see things like, that's all the stuff that's in www root. So that's kind of interesting. It's got all these DLLs local, and it also will have the local static files as well, right? So if I go, okay, so there's one other one, and it will take me just a second. You can go in here, and there's an actual .NET cache. There it is. So .NET cache. And that .NET cache, again, just for troubleshooting, you can go in here and you can see specific versions. You can see what all is installed in there, right? So you may kind of feel like app service is this thing off in the cloud that you don't have much control of. In fact, you can pretty well dig in there and see quite a bit of what's going on. So that's the Kudu console. Here's that post that I just pointed you at. So in the slides that are going to be with this, or if you just want to copy this down, AKAMS, ASP.NET Core hosting post. So this is that post where he kind of goes through and explains all the troubleshooting steps and how they're all hooked together and stuff. All right. Security, just a few real quick tips on security. One is you should be using environment variables. So you know the days of putting passwords and stuff in our web config files, and then we would have a production one and a staging one, and we'd hope nobody ever saw our production one, or all those sorts of things. You don't want to put those things in config. You want to get those out, right? So config is configuration, not secrets. So the real kind of, what you want to move towards is you have environment variables local. You can set them directly in Visual Studio. There's also a thing where you can use user secrets. I'll show you in a second. And then in production, you fill in the blanks here inside of your app settings. And these are slot-based. So I can click on one and say, this one is specific to this slot. Every time I switch them, this setting will move with this slot. So some will move with and some won't. You can set that up. So the idea is that you can go in and put your connection strings and all that sort of thing in there instead. You can also go in here, and if I right-click on this and I say, it's going to be on here somewhere, Manage User Secrets, right? So this is how I could set things up for, that's how I could set things up for locally. So here it's got a secrets.json. So I can go through and do the, set up whatever stuff. These are my local dev settings. I should not put anything important here, and I would probably exclude this via my Git attributes or Git configs. Don't allow this to be checked in. But this is kind of where you can set up your kind of low-level dev-based secrets. So then you've got dev, or you can also set them up in Visual Studio here, and then you've got your production settings. And you can have, because they're slot-based, I can say this is my QA database setting, this is my production database setting, etc. As an example, to see more of that, if I go to the live.ASP.NET site, so if any of you watch the ASP.NET community stand-up, this is the code that runs that site. And here he's got instructions on, here's how you set it up to run locally. So I showed you that JSON file. There's also, you can go in and there's this .NET user secrets. You can configure that, and you can push your secrets directly in there as well. So this is I'm setting up my local dev settings, and then my production settings are up in the cloud. You're never checking those in. That's probably the most important thing. You're not checking those settings into source control. So that's that. So this is the kind of it's simple enough. You should start doing it today. It's just it's a best practice, and it's so easy. You just do it, right? Here's the kind of more advanced. You can use Azure Key Vault. Actually, is anyone here using Azure Key Vault? Okay, cool. So the idea, the idea with Azure Key Vault is it is a, it is a real way of, it is an advanced, secure way of storing your keys. It's cryptographically secure. It's been audited. It has support for things like rolling keys and key expiration. It has support for security of who can see and do what, et cetera. So it's a pretty advanced thing. For your application to connect to it, you have a few different things. You have a client ID, a client secret, so your login stuff, and a secret URI. And then that is your, this is all set up in production. You set those environment strings. And then in your code, you write a few lines of code to read a setting directly out. So that's how you used to do it. And if you actually look at the docs, they say, here's how you read a setting out. It's just a few lines of code, but it basically says, connect to the vault, get this value, cast it as this, etc. But the cool thing is they actually just created a key vault configuration provider for ASP.NET Core. So we just shipped that. So the nice thing with that is you can just say configuration settings, and you've got this listed as one of your things, and you just read a configuration setting. So that's pretty cool. So it really makes, you got to set up Key Vault. You got to configure your keys and stuff in there. And then you configure this here. And then inside your code, you just read your configuration settings. Right? So that's pretty neat. And that ASP.NET Core, the configuration provider for Key Vault, you do need to have a few lines also, these same 3 lines, client ID, secret, and secret URI, you do need to configure those, right? Now, this is the level 2. The level 3 for overachievers is you can configure Key Vault to use a certificate for authentication, right? So your app service, you can configure a key, a cryptographic key for your site, and you configure this over with Key Vault. The two connect via keys, and there's no kind of exchanging, there's no environment settings or anything else you need to set. So those are kind of the things. These ones, Key Vault, they're definitely more advanced, but this thing here, just do it. Like, this is the way to do it. If you are writing down any kind of password, any kind of thing that you think would be a little bit damaging, or you just wouldn't like to accidentally check into a repository and make public, it should be in here, okay? And those things too, these environment variables, there's all this stuff. The configuration providers just read from environment variables. So that's kind of the plan for how all that stuff works. All right, let's talk some one quick performance tip, actually. There's tons of other great ASP.NET Core performance tips. Damien showed some this morning. There's all kinds of things you can do, like pre-compile your views, et cetera. Not going to dig into that. I'm going to show one thing that is specific for ASP.NET Core and app service, and this is the cached webroot file provider. So this is actually something that Damien just recently set up on the live ASP.NET site. And the idea with this is that, remember I told you there's those 2 drives. There's a slow mapped network drive, and it's not that slow, but it's slower, right? And then there's the local fast drive that your app actually starts and runs off of. And so if you are frequently serving up all your static files, that includes your CSS, your JavaScript, your, images, all that stuff, that it's actually serving up through the static file middleware, it's got to read that stuff from disk, and the reads are a little bit slower. So what he went through and did here is he created this cached. Of course, it's not going to scroll for me, but it is a cached webroot file provider. It is a few lines of code. This was actually, he live streamed this thing on YouTube. It was pretty fun, where he kind of wrote through and got stuff working with it and troubleshot it. But the general idea, the point is, this is out on GitHub, and you can grab this and you can use it. There's a good chance we'll ship this going forward. But what this can do is it'll say 4 files over a certain amount, just cache them in memory. And we handle all this stuff in there for eviction, for stuff that has been in too long, and et cetera. But the idea is it's just as files are loaded, it'll go through this file provider, and it'll say, do I have this one? Nope. Okay, read it. Save it in memory and serve it. And then the next hit just gets served out of memory. Uses a file watcher to detect changes, et cetera. So if we push a new file, if I push a new file up to that slow drive, then it's going to detect that it's different and it's going to reload it on the next hit, right? So that's just a nice performance tip. There's tons of others that are more ASP.NET Core specific. There's tons of others as well that are app service specific. Again, if this was a week-long course, we'd dig into all those. But this is one that's kind of that nice intersection of both. All right, we're gonna end up with looking at some of the monitoring and diagnostic stuff. I've touched on a few of these. One that I pointed out before was logging. And there's this really cool thing where you can just inline, you say, use Azure App Services. There's a package for an app service logging provider. And so it's a single one-liner in order to configure that. And when you do that, that's actually where this thing that I showed you before, those logs that I flipped on, that's actually what sets those up, right? So that's that thing when I click on logging, that will the two integrate together. So if I've turned this use app service thing and I flip that switch, then it's going to write out to that. And that was something that was new in 1.1, this app service integration stuff. So another big thing is App Insights. So App Insights is a pretty in-depth thing that tells you a ton of what's going on in your application. Pretty easy to hook up, and like I said, it's at the very simple level, you do 1 or 2 lines of code in order to configure it, and then it's going to start monitoring all kinds of stuff, including everything I'm logging and just kind of general startup and failures. I can also then instrument it quite a bit more, so I can start turning on additional things. I can write additional things to logs, and it'll pick it up. But the very simple, like click a couple of switches, is kind of a no-brainer. So let's go and look at a site I just did. So I'm going to look at, okay. So here's an example. If I say of why I do that stuff with resource groups, I can go in here and I can say, here's this resource group that I created, and this is all the stuff that I've spun up under it, right? So I have one in here. Now, the thing I didn't count on is which is the one. It's this one here because it has app service hooked up. So here's a web app that I spun up yesterday afternoon, and I configured app service for it. And in order to configure app service, I did just a few lines of code. They have this kind of walkthrough thing of here's what you need to do. When you sign up or when you configure app service, it gives you kind of a key. If you click through on here's how to configure it, it'll give you just a few lines, but it actually, this is a key that you'll add to your app settings.json, and it's just a simple instrumentation key. So if I go, I think I might have it running still. If I go in here and look at my app settings, there it is. There it is. So that's just a key that I popped in there, right? But this has actually gotten a little bit easier because in the newest thing with this 2.0 beta 1, the older one had said, like, go here, go to your, can register this service, do this other thing. Now it's really just a couple of lines. I'm going to go, I'll zoom this way. So in your view, you'll add this thing, and you'll say HTML raw in order to this is all you need to do. You inject this into your one layout, and then this is tracking all your JavaScript stuff. And there's also this, there's one line of code. I'll just show you the code I wrote. If we go into startup. So in startup, I add this services add application insights telemetry, and so that's it. Okay, so now let's look at some of the stuff that we get out of that. I'm just about out of time, but this is really quick to show. So this is, once I do that, I'm going to start seeing all kinds of stuff as far as what my app's doing. I can see, and you can spend like hours and hours going through all this. This will show me all the kind of what the hits are, what loads are taking too long. I can start drilling through and seeing specifically why, when I was getting, I can look into a specific request. I can set alerts on things, so I can say if I start getting requests that are taking this long or whatever, then I can kind of drill into that. Here I can have dependency tracking. So for instance, if I'm making a service call or a database call is slow, et cetera, it can look that up. And the one other thing that's kind of neat is there's actually this entire analytics thing. And I can go into here and I can write advanced queries. So I can go in and I can say, over the past, whatever length, after every application startup, what was the slowest thing? And I can start really drilling into all this stuff. So here's examples of, where it'll go through and it'll start showing, here's all my logs, and I can start parsing them out. And it also does visualizations and reports. So really kind of complex, advanced insights into how my application is performing. And the kind of setup for it is like 5 minutes. So it's really kind of a pretty quick no-brainer to do that. Okay, so let's review what we did. We talked about deployment options, all the different ways that I can deploy an ASP.NET Core app. Because it runs cross-platform, we showed it both running on the kind of Windows-based app service as well as app service for Linux and Docker and everywhere Docker goes. We talked about some deployment troubleshooting things. Remember that you can go into Kudu, you can do your .NET diagnostics, you can log standard out, you can look at that post and understand how ASP.NET Core module is integrating in with IIS. One quick performance tip I showed you was that that static file caching middleware. Security, remember, use your environment variables. And finally, that monitoring and diagnostics, some logging stuff, and then definitely application insights. So that's all I got. Thanks a lot.